Buenas tardes, buenas noches. Les damos la bienvenida a la inauguración del ciclo de conferencias La Humanidad Quebrada, que conmemora los 80 años del inicio del exterminio que conocemos como el Holocausto Shoah. Escucharemos a continuación al presidente del Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, Marcelo Mindlin, que nos brindará su mensaje.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches. En nombre del Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires, le doy la bienvenida a este nuevo ciclo de conferencias magistrales titulado La Humanidad Quebrada a 80 años del inicio de la Solución Final. Se cumplen hoy décadas del momento más crítico en la historia del pueblo judío, que significó un punto de quiebre para la humanidad. Es el aniversario del inicio del exterminio de los judíos de la Unión Soviética, que conllevó al posterior plan de exterminio de todos los judíos de Europa, implementado por los nazis y sus colaboradores en el contexto de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Detrás del ejército alemán, las unidades de fusilamiento denominadas Einsatzgruppen, grupos auxiliares y milicias locales comenzaban una tarea de asesinato sistemático de los judíos en el territorio soviético conquistado. Como bien analizó en su libro el doctor Browning y otros especialistas que participarán del ciclo, las conductas allí desplegadas abren múltiples incógnitas acerca de la obediencia a órdenes criminales. Si bien hubo colaboración activa, el comportamiento mayoritario de los pobladores locales fue la indiferencia. Solo unas pocas personas y familias valientes escondieron judíos en sus hogares, en sus graneros, en sus campos, en muchos casos protegiendo las vidas hasta el final de la guerra. En otros casos, pagaron con sus propias vidas y las de sus familias por estas heroicas acciones. Debemos aprender de todos los comportamientos humanos que tuvieron lugar allí y sus posibles nuevas vestimentas en el futuro. Debemos permanecer siempre alertas porque somos todos potenciales víctimas. Todos somos potenciales testigos, pero también, lamentablemente, podemos ser potenciales perpetradores. Es por ello que el museo trabaja para brindar a las nuevas generaciones todas las herramientas para que, llegado el caso, sean las conductas de rescate y protección las que sean elegidas mayoritariamente, desalentando así la indiferencia y la deshumanización. Los importantes y prestigiosos especialistas que nos acompañarán a lo largo de estas charlas magistrales han hecho aportes fundamentales para que hoy podamos enseñar mejor la Shoah y acercarnos más a la comprensión del fenómeno. Queremos hacer un agradecimiento especial por aceptar generosamente nuestra invitación para que el público hispanoparlante pueda acceder a sus miradas más actuales sobre el camino que llevó a la Solución Final. Aprovecho para saludar calurosamente al doctor Christopher Browning, quien con su obra inauguró nuevas formas de comprender el fenómeno humano en la Shoah, y agradecemos que haya aceptado inaugurar este ciclo. Esperamos seguir contribuyendo a la memoria, a la reflexión y al debate en este importante aniversario para ser cada vez más conscientes del valor principal que tenemos los seres humanos, la vida. Muchísimas gracias y que todos podamos aprovechar al máximo esta serie de conferencias magistrales. Buenas noches.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo, por tus palabras. En unos minutos comenzará la primera conferencia del ciclo y queremos agradecer a quienes lo hicieron posible. En primer lugar, a los especialistas invitados de prestigio internacional que nos permitirán conocer desde la Argentina diversas perspectivas de aquel momento clave para la humanidad. Agradecemos profundamente a los doctores Christopher Browning, Peter Hayes, Christian Gerlach, Olivier Biebiorka, Ilya Altman y Yehuda Bauer, por haber aceptado nuestra invitación y brindándonos su tiempo y sus conocimientos para este ciclo. Muchas gracias a quienes organizaron este importante ciclo de conferencias: Bruno Garbari y Marcia Raz, junto a Eliana Ambra, Jonathan Epstein, Brenda Fischer y Gabriel Merlo. También agradecemos a Diana Wang, Emanuel Kahn y Eugenia Carbone por acompañarnos en la moderación de los diversos paneles. Y como siempre, extendemos nuestra gratitud al gran equipo de trabajo que conforma el Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires. Finalmente, queremos agradecer al Instituto Auschwitz para la Paz y la Reconciliación por acompañarnos y apoyarnos en este ciclo, en especial a su directora para América Latina, Eugenia Carbone. El 22 de junio de 1941, el régimen nazi liderado por Adolf Hitler había decidido ir contra lo que consideraban su mayor enemigo, el judeo-bolchevismo. El antisemitismo nazi, que había comenzado como un discurso ideológico racista en la década del 20, se transformó en leyes de discriminación y segregación en la década del 30, y a finales de 1939 se había dado el paso crucial al aislamiento de los judíos en guetos en la Polonia ocupada. De pronto se produce el gran quiebre. Tras la ruptura del pacto Ribbentrop-Molotov, hombres, mujeres, niños y ancianos de las ciudades y aldeas eran despojados en pocas horas de sus bienes, de sus familias y de sus vidas. En bosques, descampados, barrancos y fosas comunes cavadas por ellos mismos o por sus vecinos, eran fusilados día tras día por los Einsatzgruppen, los grupos auxiliares y los colaboradores locales. El quiebre consistió tanto en el inicio del exterminio como también en el momento en el que se rompieron las promesas de la modernidad. Un Estado moderno con un gran desarrollo cultural, educativo, tecnológico y científico se preparaba para masacrar a 6 millones de judíos de forma organizada, sistemática e industrial. Abogados, militares, médicos, arquitectos, ingenieros, burócratas y otros especialistas pusieron todos sus conocimientos al servicio de la planificación más eficiente para matar seres humanos. Tendremos la posibilidad de escuchar a expertos que nos acercarán a aquel momento de quiebre para complejizarnos y comprender un poco más. ¿Qué sucedió allí? ¿Quiénes y por qué llevaron adelante el Holocausto? ¿Qué elementos fueron cruciales para su decisión? ¿Por qué hubo colaboración y silencio mayoritariamente por parte de las sociedades europeas? ¿De qué forma analizar aquellos eventos puede contribuir para su prevención en el futuro? Esperamos, como siempre, que estas preguntas sobrevuelen los próximos encuentros. Hoy tendremos el honor de escuchar al doctor Christopher Browning, quien hizo un invaluable aporte para que quienes nos dedicamos a la transmisión de la Shoah podamos tener una mayor dimensión de los procesos genocidas, de las influencias y motivaciones de los perpetradores que se dan en esos contextos. Muchas gracias, doctor Browning, por su obra y por ser el disertante de la apertura del ciclo. Los dejamos en la compañía del licenciado Bruno Garbari, quien moderará el panel de hoy y que contará con la traducción simultánea de Dana Ioffe. La posibilidad de escuchar la disertación en español se encuentra en la botonera del Zoom a la derecha y les permite elegir el canal en el idioma correspondiente. Muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañan hoy. Buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Buenas tardes. Como dijo Jonathan, hoy contamos con uno de los historiadores más destacados en la historia del Holocausto y quien ha tenido una gran influencia en la formación de quienes formamos parte del staff del Museo del Holocausto de Buenos Aires. El doctor Browning fue profesor durante 25 años en la Pacific Lutheran University en Tacoma, en el estado de Washington de los Estados Unidos, y dictó clases durante 15 años en la University of North Carolina a Chapel Hill hasta su jubilación en 2014. Es autor de 9 libros relacionados con la Alemania nazi y el Holocausto. Ha actuado como perito experto en juicios tanto contra nazis acusados de perpetrar sus crímenes como a negadores del Holocausto, como el juicio de Ernst Swendel en Canadá y el de Deborah Lipstadt contra David Irving en Londres. Doctor Browning, tenemos el privilegio de escucharlo.
Muchas
Good afternoon from the west coast of the United States. I guess it's evening in Buenos Aires. As I'm the first in this lecture series, I'm going to try in as compressed a manner as I can to sort of tell the story from the early 1920s or 1919 up to the eve of the preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Peter Hayes at the next lecture will talk about 1941 as the year of decision. And I wanted to, in a sense, set the stage for that by discussing three different topics. The first is the crystallization of Hitler's ideology in the 1920s. The second will be the development of Nazi Jewish policy, primarily through legislation in Germany in the 1930s, 1933 to 1939. And then the opening period of Germany extending its persecution of the Jews to all of the conquered and occupied territories from 1939 to 1941, and how that, in a sense, accelerated the path towards the final solution, the decisions that were taken in 1941. So let's go back to 1919. World War I has just ended. Hitler remains in the army, in a sense, the only real home that he had known up until then, as a propaganda officer. And he is assigned by his commander to answer a letter that had been sent to the commanding officer about the nature of the Jewish question. And this is the first document we have, the first political document we have from Hitler, the so-called Gemlich letter, in which Hitler sets out his belief that the Jewish question is a racial question, not a religious question. Jews are who they are, not because of what they believe, but because of their unchangeable racial characteristics. That these racial characteristics made them alien in Germany and traitors to Germany. He blamed them for the so-called stab in the back for causing German defeat in World War I. And that ultimately the only way to deal with the problem of these traitorous Jews, alien Jews in Germany, was to remove them from Germany altogether. That was his phrase, removal altogether, by which he meant driving them out, expulsion, what we now would call ethnic cleansing. As he became more involved in building up the political movement of the National Socialists, he leaves the army and becomes a full-time politician. He works out a more complex ideology in the 1920s, at the core of which is his belief that all of history is a racial struggle. If Karl Marx believed history was determined by class struggle, Hitler in turn believed that history was determined by race struggle, and that all races were fated, in a sense, to either win in this racial struggle, expand, take more territory, give birth to more children, and to grow their population, or conversely, to lose territory, to shrink in size, and ultimately be subject to total domination and even disappearance. It was a constant struggle in which people either went up or down. There was no stability, there was no equality. Races were inherently unequal and struggled in this eternal racial struggle against one another. For Hitler, that meant for Germany to recover from the defeat of World War I and to reemerge as a great power, it needed to find what he called Lebensraum, or space for living, that Germany had to vastly expand territory if it was going to expand its population. And since the Kaiser had failed in taking on a battle against the European powers with overseas empires, France and England in World War I, for Hitler, the logical place for Germany to expand was to the east. The vast territories of the Soviet Union, which he felt conveniently were ruled by the Communist Party, which he felt was founded by Jews and therefore ultimately doomed to failure, so that historically he was in the lucky position to be able to take in the end great vast territories from what he thought was a government capable of subverting others, but incapable of ruling in its own right, the Jews always having lived as parasites, never as a state-building people was how he understood it. Some then have summarized Hitler's view as race and space. The Jews as the main racial enemy, but all other races in competition with Germany, and Germany needing to conquer space in order to grow and expand. And in order to do that effectively, they were going to have to deal with the internal Jewish enemy first of all. And the Jewish enemy threatened Germany in basically three ways. First of all, Jews living in Germany and living whatever country they lived in, he said, lived only as parasites. History had shown there was no Jewish nation. They only lived as a parasitical people. And that living among others as an alien everywhere, they threatened the pure blood, as he put it, of the German people, of the Aryan race. And it was axiomatic to Hitler that pure blood was strong and mixed blood was weak. Now, there's obviously no biological scientific reality to that, but that was simply his axiomatic understanding of how race worked in history. Pure race is strong, mixed race is weak, and that therefore the first threat that Jews posed to Germany was by simply living in Germany is that they would mix their blood with German blood, and the more mixed German blood became, the weaker Germans would be, the less able they would be to fight the no-holds-barred wars that were required to conquer more space. The second way in which Jews threatened Germany in Hitler's mind was that they were not only the carriers of an alien blood, but they were the carriers of subversive ideas. The Jewish spirit, as well as Jewish blood, was dangerous to Germany. And he saw basically in history three great Jewish conspiracies based on notions of human equality, of human compassion, of loving one's neighbor, that threatened the capacity for Germans to remain hardened and tough and willing to fight cruel and endless wars of conquest. The first of these great Jewish conspiracies, ironically, is Christianity in his mind. Hitler is an anti-Christian anti-Semite. He believes Christianity is a Jewish conspiracy to weaken the rest of the world because Christianity taught love thy neighbor as thyself, turn the other cheek. Basically, Christianity is what had brought down the Roman Empire, and that Christianity was as a religion was a weakening idea or religion that for Germany to recover, it had to overcome this first Jewish conspiracy based on human compassion and human love. The second great Jewish conspiracy was liberalism, particularly as exemplified in the French and American revolutions and constitutional democracies thereafter, because they are based on the idea of equality. Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. For Hitler, that was absolutely the wrong message. Men were not created equal, they were unequal, and the strong had to destroy the weak in order to obtain their living space and to expand and get rid of worthless, weak people. So liberalism, with its equality before the law, with its democratic notions, was the second great Jewish conspiracy aimed at weakening Germany. And of course, what could be more evidence of that than after the stab in the back of the Weimar Republic is imposed upon defeated Germany, a democratic, crippling form of government that was intended to keep Germany perpetually weak. The third great Jewish conspiracy in Hitler's mind was communism. Of course, what does it teach? The brotherhood of all workers. Workers of the world unite. You know only your class solidarity, not national loyalty. So these were the great Jewish ideas in Hitler's mind, the Jewish conspiracies in Hitler's mind, Christianity, liberalism, communism, that were going, if they infected Germans, would prevent them from winning the war for space. That was the precondition for the German race to rise and triumph. In that, then, the Soviet Union holds a rather special place. It is the territory that Hitler must conquer militarily if he's going to get Lebensraum. It is the ideology that Hitler must destroy if Nazism is to prevail over communism. And it is the breeding grounds of world Jewry, Eastern Europe, if Hitler is to win the racial struggle against the Jews. So ultimately, this ideology points towards a territorial, ideological, and racial war in the East, which of course will eventually culminate in the attack on the Soviet Union in June of 1941. That is not a blueprint, but it is a vision and a set of goals which sets up the agenda or the guideposts for all of those that want to advance their careers, prove their loyalty to Hitler by, and this is Ian Kershaw's famous phrase from his biography of Hitler, to work towards the Fuhrer, to prove themselves by doing for Hitler what he wants done without having to be ordered to do it, to engage in anticipatory compliance, anticipatory achievement of Hitler's goals, and thus the ideology is key in a sense, setting the agenda that provide the guideposts, which will be the goals to which all sorts of Nazis are going to work without having to be given explicit orders or having to be micromanaged by Hitler from above. Now, the first point at which, of course, the Germans can begin to carry out Jewish policy, can begin to do things concretely against Jews, is after Hitler comes to power in January of 1933. And from 1933 to 1939, Jewish policy is basically domestic policy. It is aimed at a small sliver of European Jewry, the 500, 600,000 German Jews, which are, of course, a small portion of European Jewry, which is in turn a small portion of world Jewry. So the initial targets of the Nazis are only one very small group, but of course they are utterly exposed in Germany to the unrestrained zeal of Nazi anti-Semites. Now, Karl Schleunis wrote a very important book published way back in 1970 entitled The Twisted Road to Auschwitz, in which he tried to show that between 1933 and 39, the advance of Nazi policy against the Jews, the intensification of the persecution of the Jews did not follow a straight line. It was uneven, it had zigs and it had zags, it was twisted, and it alternated between periods of intensity and then periods of more or less calm or less intensity. And it involved different groups that didn't agree among each other on what the answer to the Jewish question was and what the solution to the Jewish problem was. As long as Hitler is there and says there is a Jewish problem, then of course it has to be solved, but that does not spell out exactly what a solution to the Jewish question means. So Jewish policy between 1933 and 1939 is contested. And different groups in Germany put forward different ideas to advance their own careers, and to win favor with Hitler, but also, of course, because they are truth-believing anti-Semites and think that their way is the best way to achieve whatever a solution to the Jewish question might be. Now, I would argue very roughly this takes place in sort of three spurts of legislation, and that each of these spurts of legislation or clusters of legislation has a different focus. In 1933, you have a wave of legislation in Germany that I call the civic death of German Jewry. What I mean by that is this was the end of equality before the law for German Jews. This is when they ceased to be equal citizens. The first piece in this legislation was the law for the restoration of the German civil service, that basically drove Jews out of all the occupations that had civil service rank in Germany, and that was quite a number. The civil service played a much larger legal role in Germany than it does, say, today in the United States. Many more jobs had civil service status, and to drive the Jews out of the civil service was a milestone that marked then driving them out of all other spheres of German life as well. And what quickly followed was legislation that restricted and drove them out of medicine, out of law, out of education, out of cultural life, so that in very short order, Jews could not be on the stage as actors, Jews could not write articles in newspapers as journalists, Jews could not publish as novelists, Jews could not play in orchestras as musicians, Jews could not practice medicine on any patients other than Jews, Jews could not represent customers other than Jews in court as lawyers, and Jews could not hold any government jobs. So this was a sweeping assault upon Jews in the public sphere. Now, this did not yet attack the Jewish economics position in the private sphere, their ownership of property and their running of businesses, but it certainly was an expulsion of the Jews from the public sphere and the end of their civic equality. There was then a kind of pause in 1934. Hitler has other issues to deal with. And then in 1935, agitation began again. And what was beginning to emerge in this were three rather distinct groups that were trying to shape Nazi Jewish policy. One were the bureaucrats of the Interior Ministry and other ministerial bureaucracies that thought you could solve the Jewish question simply by passing more laws and restricting the Jews in more ways. There were the party radicals, the real activists of the party, that wanted a much more aggressive policy, and particularly one that was more gratifying emotionally. These were the people driving the anti-Jewish riots, the rituals of humiliation to march Jews through the streets with signs hanging around their necks, which we've all seen the photos of, the harassment of anybody that socialized with Jews, much less couples that wanted to intermarry, Jews and non-Jews, and attacks upon Jewish stores, the breaking of the windows of Jewish shops and this sort of thing. These were the agitators. These were people that thought you could solve the Jewish question if you just had enough physical violence against Jews. And then thirdly, there were people in the economics ministry who basically believed that whatever else happened, Germany had other priorities at the moment than persecuting Jews, particularly if it affected the economic sphere. For them, German rearmament and German economic recovery were the prime priorities, and anything in Jewish policy that threatened to upset German economic recovery or German rearmament had to be forbidden, had to be put in abeyance, had to be put on hold. So they weren't trying so much to protect Jews for the sake of Jews, they were trying to restrain certain aspects of Jewish persecution insofar as it had any potential to threaten economic recovery and the ability to finance German rearmament. And those people clashed again in 1935. Hitler sided with the economic policy of economic restraint. He continued to insist that you shouldn't be attacking Jewish stores and Jewish property, but he did side with the party radicals on the issue of sexual relations between Jews and Germans, this more emotional issue. And so in September of 1935, he issues the Nuremberg Laws that forbid marriage between Germans and Jews, that forbid sexual relations outside of marriage between Germans and Jews, that forbid German households from hiring young women as employees within the household on the assumption that Jewish employers would sexually exploit their young non-Jewish employees. And so all of this was designed in a sense to gratify the anti-Semitic sexual obsessions of the party radicals and to at least mark, in a sense, a new phase forward, what I call the social death of German Jewry. Because once you had the Nuremberg Laws, basically nobody in Germany, Jew or German, could be seen socializing together, fraternizing together, being friendly with one another, because they would open themselves up to denunciation by any party radical that this was an example of forbidden sexual relations. These people would endanger themselves and whoever they were trying to be friendly with. So that for the most part, even longtime Jews and Germans that had been friends forever understood that they could not endanger one another. They had to cut off the relations they had. And Jews sunk into deep social isolation in Germany. This is what I would call the social death of German Jewry. It's also the occasion then in which the bureaucrats had to legally define who a Jew was, because if you were forbidding marriages and people came and applied for marriage licenses, you had to have a legal basis for defining someone as Jew or not. And that's when they worked out this definition that a full Jew was someone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents, and half Jews and quarter Jews were so-called Mischlinge, or part Jews in a different legal status, and full Germans were those with no Jewish blood 2 generations earlier. Why did they have to do it that way? Well, quite simply because race is an imagined construct. There is no scientific basis by which you can identify who is a Jew or who is an Aryan. There's no biological basis for Aryanism. It is an imagined status. And so that the only thing they could do was go back to the religion of the grandparents at a time before there was much mixed marriage, before you had people who were crossing the religious line. And so the presumption was that if you had a person who was a practicing Jew or a practicing Christian 2 generations earlier, that also meant that they were either a Jew or a German in terms of race. At least that's, in a sense then, the Nazis were in the difficult position of trying to define race by religion, because religion was seen as a racial marker 2 generations earlier, even if it obviously was not in the current era. The third phase, what I call the economic death of German Jewry, comes in 1938. And this is when you have the final onslaught against Jewish property, Jewish businesses in Germany, the final expropriation and confiscation of Jewish possessions in Germany, the total impoverishment of German Jewry. This is launched basically by 2 new groups that enter the fight over controlling Jewish policy beginning in 1935, 1936. And these 2 newcomers to the attempt to shape Nazi Jewish policy, 2 new competitors to become the controllers of Nazi Jewish policy, were Heinrich Himmler and the SS on the one hand, and Hermann Goering in the so-called 4-year plan. The 4-year plan was the Agency for German Rearmament on the other hand, the Agency for the Economic Preparation for War. And they more or less made an alliance in which Goering would take care of the economic expropriation of German Jewry, and Himmler would be in charge of making life so miserable for German Jews in Germany that they would voluntarily leave because they would realize they had no future there. This is the point, at least, at which top Nazis finally sort of defined what it meant to, quote, solve the Jewish question. And the Jewish question would be solved in Germany when Germany became, quote, free of Jews or pure of Jews. Judenfrei or Judenrein were the 2 German terms for this. So now there is, in a sense, a finish line in which the Germans can say, if we can get over that finish line, we have solved the problem. And that is, if we can force all the Jews to leave Germany while keeping all of their property behind, then we have done what we set out to do. And the main impetus for this basically is first the Nazi invasion and occupation of Austria in the spring of 1938, when Adolf Eichmann is sent to Vienna and creates a system for vastly accelerated forced emigration. Up until then, German Jews have been encouraged to emigrate as long as they're willing to leave without property. Eichmann devises ways to have a kind of streamlined forced emigration that creates rates of emigration from Austria in 1938, vastly, many times fold what the Third Reich had accomplished in the pre-1938 boundaries up until then. So the SS, and Eichmann in particular, become the experts in ethnic cleansing, finding ways to force people to leave desperately by making their life so miserable that they realize they have no other option. And Goering is the one who carries out an inventory of Jewish property and then begins to confiscate it law by law in 1938. And finally, with the Kristallnacht riots, with the November pogrom, this is accelerated even further, so that Jews are forced to pay for the property damage that has been inflicted upon them, so that German insurance agencies aren't bankrupted. They now have the excuse and the reason to basically expropriate all remaining Jewish property and to leave German Jews penniless. It also, of course, was the last horrific act that convinced all remaining German Jews that still had any hope that they could stick it out, that they could simply endure long enough that they would survive the Nazi regime, that there was no future. After Kristallnacht in 38, all German Jews are desperate to get out. The tragedy, of course, was that no other country would take them, and there wasn't much time for them to escape. Now there was less than a year until the outbreak of war, and which boundaries would be even more closed and emigration become even more difficult. So the 1930s was a series of different phases of different kinds of legislation proposed by different groups within the Third Reich that finally had, in a sense, a consensus goal that which was the creation of a Germany free of Jews, and which by 1939, the end seemed to be in sight with the accelerated pressure on German Jews to leave after Kristallnacht. That was the situation in January of 1939, which is now just 9 months before the outbreak of war, in which Hitler gives his so-called Reichstag speech. This was January 30th, 1939, the speech he gives on the anniversary of his coming to power 6 years earlier. And it is a long 2-hour speech. In the middle of that speech, there are several paragraphs that he devotes to the Jewish question, in which first he chides the non-German governments if they are so anxious to criticize us about how we treat our Jews. He says all they have to do is take them off our hands, and he accuses them of hypocrisy, of putting up barriers to Jewish immigration, not taking German Jews, while at the same time criticizing Germany for how it treats its own Jews, and basically accusing them of total hypocrisy, and thus having no moral right, no moral high ground on which to criticize what Germany is doing. And then in the second paragraph, he goes on to say that he has often in his life been a prophet, and people used to laugh at him. The Jews used to laugh at him when he gave his prophecies. Given how much has already come true, he wonders and mocks them. Are they still laughing now? And then he says, I will be again a prophet again today. And that if world Jewry plunges Germany, once again into a world war, if world Jewry plunges Germany once again into a world war, it will not end in the defeat of Germany and the Bolshevization of the world, but rather in the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. Now, people have interpreted this speech in different ways. Some have said this is simply him telling us what he's going to do. This is proof that he had a grand design, he had a grand plan. He's announcing in 1939 the final solution. That's often referred to as the intentionalist interpretation. Things happened in Germany because Hitler intended them so, and he announced his intention in 1939 to destroy the Jewish race in Europe. A second interpretation says this was simply an attempt to blackmail the Allies. You better let the Jews in. You better take Jews trying to leave Germany, because if you don't, then you will have their deaths on your hands. It's attempted at kind of a blackmail. A third interpretation is the one that I think is most probable. They're not mutually exclusive, but I think the third is one I would argue, that Hitler's audience there is the top Nazi leadership. I mean, who is in attendance at this but all of the Reichstag and the top Nazi leaders? And he is, in a sense, announcing to them now the next phase. We are no longer concerned just with Jews in Germany, but we are going to solve the Jewish question in Europe. And that's going to be incumbent upon us when war breaks out. He knows war is going to break out. He's planning war. He knows in January of 39 that there will be war, maybe not knowing it will be in September of 39, but knowing it will be soon. and setting out the expectation among them, in a sense, the necessity for them to understand that when Germany wages war and conquers other territory, it will be incumbent upon Germany to solve the Jewish question in the rest of Europe. They must get rid of the Jews in all of the Europe, not just in Germany. It must be the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe, not just in Germany. Now the question is, which of those three approaches to Hitler's January speech is more probable? And I would argue the following. If you want to know what Hitler was thinking in January of 1939, you must look at what Nazi top leadership was doing after that speech between 1939 and 1941. How did Heinrich Himmler understand what was expected of him? How did Heinrich Himmler attempt to, quote, work towards the Fuhrer? And the answer is that Himmler set about to create in succession three plans for the total ethnic cleansing of Jews out of Europe, a combination of what I would call expulsion and decimation. If the first phase of German policy from 1939 was in a sense expropriation and forced emigration, 1939 to 1941 I would call decimation and expulsion. The Jews are forced to leave Europe, and it's taken for granted that in the course of forcing Jews to leave Europe, a large number of them are going to die. It is not yet a plan for the systematic and total destruction of all Jews. It is not yet the final solution, but it certainly is a bloody solution. It certainly is a destructive solution in which it is taken for granted that the loss of Jewish life will be high. But the finish line, the goal is there will be no Jews left in Europe, and that those that are not killed will be forced out of Europe and sent somewhere else. What are these succession of plans? Well, as soon as Germany attacks Poland, within a month after the attack on Poland and the conquest of Poland, once the Germans know that Poland has been defeated, that the Allies have not exerted a counterattack on the Western Front to create a second front, and that Stalin has abided by the terms of the non-aggression pact with Hitler. He's taken his half of the Eastern Europe, Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia from Romania, which is Hitler promised him his booty if he would stand aside and let Hitler defeat Poland. They would partition Eastern Europe between them. And that Stalin has abided by that, taken his share, and at the moment has been satisfied with that. The Nazis, Himmler, Hitler, and others are now faced with a quandary. And the quandary is this, that with every new German territorial and military and diplomatic success, they take a step backwards in solving the Jewish question. When they annexed Austria, they got all the Austrian Jews. When they annexed Czechoslovakia, they got all the Czech and Slovak Jews. When they conquered Poland, they got nearly 2 million more Jews. When they conquered France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, they got all those Jews. And when they, after being victorious, could now force other countries in Europe into subordinate alliance systems, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they had within this growing German sphere all of these Jews. So Germany now doesn't facing what to do with 600,000 German Jews. They're trying to deal with what to do with 9 million European Jews. And so the issue now is how to get them out of Europe. Immigration obviously is not a solution. And so Himmler hits upon the notion of decimation and expulsion. Now, the first plan he puts forward was known as the Lublin Reservation. The furthest sliver of territory in the German Empire on the boundary line of the demarcation line between Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's conquered Poland was the district of Lublin. And so it is going to be turned into a Jewish reservation, a place to which you will send Jews from Germany and Poland, and to create those areas then free of Jews by sending them all to this little corner called the Lublin Reservation. A Nazi inspector who goes out to look at the territory reports back, quite literally, The Lublin Reservation is an ideal site for a Jewish reservation because the swampy nature of the territory assures a vast decimation of the Jewish population. This, as I say, is going to be expulsion and decimation. Move the Jews out of the German sphere, taking it for granted that in the course of that, many of them will die. Now, it turns out that moving all of Polish Jews and all of German Jews to the Lublin Reservation proves to be impossible. It proves to be impossible because of two things. The first of all, Goering is in charge of trying now to harness the German-occupied territories of Poland to the German war economy, because he's still at war with France and England. And you cannot mine coal in Silesia, and you cannot grow wheat in fields in the Wartegau and elsewhere in Poland if you basically have depopulated it. That his goals to chase out not only Jews, but to chase out Poles as well. This is going to be an ethnic cleansing of all the non-Germans. It simply couldn't be done in wartime. And Goering basically says, win the war now, racial experimentation later. And Hans Frank, who is the colonial governor of what becomes the general government, that small section of central Poland that is not going to be annexed outright to Germany. Half of the German gains in Poland are going to be annexed to Germany and cleared of all of their Polish and Jewish populations. And the general government, which is this central part of Poland, is going to become a German colony. One of its districts is the Lublin Reservation for Jews. The others will be the areas into which Poles of Western Poland are expelled, if that plan had gone forward. Hans Frank, who heads the general government, doesn't want his model colony to become the population dumping ground, in a sense, the demographic garbage dump of the Third Reich. So he opposes it because it creates chaos. If you send all sorts of people ethnically cleansed out of Western Poland, Poles and Jews, into central Poland with no possessions and simply dump them, well, of course, central Poland will become a vast graveyard. We'll have epidemic chaos and whatever. So he opposes it. And so Himmler, in effect, finds that he has to back off. He's trying to do too much too quickly. And so by the spring of 1940, the Lublin Reservation has come to a halt, and ethnic cleansing from Western Poland of both Jews and Poles and the sending of Jews to the Lublin Reservation slows down to a trickle because the war is still going on against England and France. Now, in May, June, of course, Germany launches its offensive in the West. They conquer France in a 5-week blitzkrieg, faster than anyone could possibly have imagined. And suddenly, Goering's claim, win the war now, experiment racially later, seems to no longer be binding. And now you also have the French Empire as a possible place for a new reservation, because you're going to divide up the French Empire. So we have a remarkable document that Himmler writes in the 3rd week of May, in which he goes in to Hitler on, I think, May 25th, just after the British army has been cut off at Dunkirk. Victory in the West is assured. He's conquered the Western continent up to the English Channel. And Himmler proposes this to Hitler as a memorandum on the treatment of alien populations in Eastern Europe, in which he reiterates that the areas Germany wants to take over and incorporate into the Third Reich must be totally cleansed of Jews and Jews and Poles. Poles should be reduced to basically a slave race. They have no other function than to work for Germans and should be totally denationalized. That is, they should be deprived of any national identity. So Polish universities are closed, Polish teachers and faculty are put in concentration camps, are murdered. The Polish leadership is to be killed. All the carriers of Polish nationality to be done away with. What Raphael Lemkin would later call cultural genocide. You don't kill all the Poles, but you kill the idea of Polish nationality, of Polish identity. For the Jews, Himmler says now the possibility exists of sending them to some territory overseas, perhaps in Africa. And then he goes on to say, and this is sort of the conclusion of this memorandum, these ideas may seem very harsh, but if we consider the Bolshevik method of an extermination of entire people as un-German and impossible, this is the most humane solution. Let me repeat that. This is Himmler in May of 1940 in a memorandum submitted to Adolf Hitler, in which he says, if we consider the extermination of an entire people as un-German and impossible, then this is the most humane solution. And Himmler writes afterwards, the Fuhrer agreed with my memorandum, said it was along his line of thinking, and told me that I could move forward with it. And this leads then to, where in Africa are you going to send the Jews? And one of the old ideas of anti-Semitic quacks in the late 19th century was to send all the Jews to the island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. And Madagascar is a French colony. You've just defeated France. You're going to carve up the French Empire in the coming peace treaty. And so the proposal emerges in June of 1940, known as the Madagascar Plan, to round up all the Jews of Europe and to send them to Madagascar. Now, again, nobody thought most of them would survive. Everyone understood this would not only be an expulsion plan, but a decimation plan, but it is not yet the final solution. And Hitler agrees. And for the next 3 months, we can tell from internal papers in the Nazi regime, this is taken seriously. I mean, to us, it looks like a lunatic scheme, but it was never attempted to be put into practice. What would we have thought if we had found papers about Auschwitz, but they never been able to attempt to put it into practice? We would have considered that totally fantastic and beyond imagination. The Madagascar Plan was, in a sense, the limit of their fantastical powers in 1940, but what they sincerely intended. It has to be canceled in the fall of 1940 because, of course, Britain does not surrender, and Britain is not defeated in the Battle of Britain. And as long as Britain is not defeated, the British Navy makes any shipping of Jews to Madagascar impossible. So in the fall of 1940, Hitler faces a double quandary. On the one hand, he has conquered the continent, but the war is not over. England does not surrender, and he has not found a way to drive England out of the war. On the other hand, he has won these great victories, but now he has far more Jews, millions of Jews within the German sphere, and is further away from his solution to a Jewish question than he has ever been. And how can you solve both questions at once? How can you drive England out of the war and open a door to get rid of the Jews off the continent of Europe at one and the same time? And that is when Hitler opts for breaking his non-aggression pact with Stalin and to begin to plan for an invasion of the Soviet Union. Certainly, I will leave to Peter Hayes to talk about the actual planning in the spring of 1941 for Operation Barbarossa, the so-called criminal orders. But alongside that, much less explicit because it was not as immediate. It wasn't going to be done until after the war had been fought and won. But at least in outline was the notion that after the Soviet Union had been conquered, the third Jewish reservation, the third site of Jewish expulsion and decimation would be Siberia and the Arctic. That the Jews of Russia and the Jews of Europe would be driven there. As I say, it does not reach the same stage of detailed planning that we have on paper for the Lublin Reservation or the Madagascar Plan, but it was what they had in the preliminary stages of planning before, in a sense, the momentum of planning for a war of destruction in the Soviet Union leaves that superseded, and then events in the summer of 41 in the Soviet Union makes that obsolete, and they ultimately decide to go yet a step further. But in a sense, I wanted to set the stage for Peter Hayes in the next lecture to get you to the spring of 1941, in which we have seen, in a sense, three phases: the crystallization of Hitler's ideology of race and space, in which the Jews represent a kind of mortal enemy to Germany. As long as they are there, they stand in the way of Germany's capacity to occupy, seize, to wage the wars it needs to wage and win the Lebensraum that it needs to win. if the German race is to expand and prosper. And secondly, a period of 33 to 39 of trial, error, improvisation, contestation, in which various groups try to figure out what it means to solve the Jewish question, what Karl Freundis called the twisted road to Auschwitz, which ended with a consensus that solving the Jewish question in Germany meant creating a Germany free of Jews, and ending with Hitler's January speech that now, in fact, we're entering a third phase of war to conquer the European continent, which means we will have the Jews of Europe, not just the Jews of Germany, to deal with. And as I have argued, understood by Himmler and others around Hitler to be an invitation to create vast schemes of expulsion and decimation, which were three in sequence: the Lublin Plan, the Madagascar Plan, and the plan for the Siberia option. But none of those worked. All of those, it turned out, had great logistical problems, practical problems. And one of the lessons, in a sense, the Germans learned in the course of 39-41, with the frustration of not being able to use victory to solve the Jewish question, was simply that in the end, it was going to be easier to kill Jews than to expel them. Jews under their control, they could expel, but finding places to expel them to, the logistics of expelling them was a whole more difficult situation. And that mentally then, by the spring of 1941, they are beginning to think, ready to think in a different framework from that of expulsion and decimation. They are mentally prepared, one might say, for different notions of a final solution to the Jewish question, which comes out of the decisions of 1941, which I will now leave to Peter Hayes. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Browning, for
las que se llegó el camino hacia la solución final y las distintas perspectivas que brindan historiadores frente a esta temática. Su disertación nos permite esclarecer la complejidad con la cual se transitó el camino hacia la solución final. Vamos a arrancar con algunas preguntas, ¿no? Y la primera de ellas es el rol de Hitler, ¿no? ¿En qué medida Hitler jugó un rol central en el proceso de la decisión de la solución final? ¿Y cuál fue el rol de los escalones intermedios del partido en las iniciativas que derivaron posteriormente en la solución final?
Yeah, I would say that Hitler's governing style really, or his decision-making behavior really comes in three different ways. That is, he doesn't act the same way in different areas. In military and diplomatic areas, Hitler was very involved with detail. He's a micromanager. So he is, in fact, deeply involved in, say, the diplomatic maneuverings around Munich and around German rearmament and the march to war, and that he is a micromanager in military diplomatic affairs. In many domestic affairs, once he has consolidated power in 1934 and there is no further internal threat to his rule, he really is kind of the absentee landlord. That is, he basically says to people, this is the problem I want you to solve, and when you come back in 10 years and tell me you solved it, I won't even ask you how you did it. You're free to do it in any way you can. So he doesn't want to be bothered with those details. He wants those problems taken off his table and solved without any attention or effort from him. Now, in racial policy, Jewish policy, I think there's something in the middle in which Hitler is the exhorter and the prophet, in which he sort of keeps the pot boiling. That is, he continues to issue statements about how central the Jewish question is, the need to solve the problem, and in the case, say, of the January speech, being, as he put it, I'll be a prophet once again. I prophesy that in the case of a Jews launching a new world war, it will end in the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe, sort of outlining the direction that he wants things to go, but then leaving it to others to come to him with concrete plans. It is Himmler that comes to him with the Lublin Plan. It is Ribbentrop in the Foreign Office that comes to him with the Madagascar Plan. I think it's Heydrich that comes to him with the Siberian Plan. That different people are competing to figure out, what does Hitler want? What does he mean by this? How can I win favor with him and get the rewards that come with solving problems that Hitler wants solved? So Hitler only, in a sense, has to specify the goal he wants, the problem he wants solved, and the direction he wants that to go in. He doesn't have to draw up his own plans and his own proposals. He simply has to react to the proposals that are brought to him. And depending upon the situation, you can give it a red light, a green light, a yellow light, and that he, in a sense, is the traffic controller as to how far things proceed on the basis of these proposals that he has elicited and that others have brought to him. So the whole system does not work without Nazi power brokers beneath Hitler and without their cadres of experts who will draw up these plans. When Himmler tells his people to draw up X or Y plan, or Ribbentrop wants the Jewish expert in the German Foreign Office to draw up the details of the Madagascar plan, you have people involved from Hitler at the top through the big power brokers down to the mid-level bureaucrats and pencil pushers and experts and problem solvers that are at the core of the Nazi regime. So it takes all of them, and they interact, and it's that interaction that is crucial.
During this period after the invasion of Poland, the ghetto.
Siguiente, la concentración de los judíos en los guetos fue una respuesta improvisada ante el fracaso de las soluciones territoriales o pensada como un paso previo para el exterminio masivo de los judíos?
I would say it is the former, not the latter. Now, we do know in September of 39, Heydrich briefly encourages concentrating Jews in main transportation centers because he thinks he's going to be able to expel them to Lublin very quickly. When that does not work, then basically everything is frozen. And in a series of local decisions by different local Nazis in different territories at different times, citing different reasons, and often devising different models of ghettoization between the spring of 1940 and basically the fall of 40, early 40, or spring of 41, actually, ghettoization spreads over Poland in a very uneven way. It begins, of course, with Łódź, the first great ghetto in the Wartegau in the spring of 1940. Warsaw is ghettoized in November of 40. Southern Poland is ghettoized basically in the spring of 41. Some ghettos are open, some ghettos are sealed. Some ghettos are created by bringing people in from the countryside and concentrating them. Other ghettos are created when much of the urban population is expelled to the countryside and you have only a small remnant left to ghettoize, such as in Krakow, so that there is no single model, there is no single timetable, there is no single model, and they cite different justifications. Sometimes it's epidemic, sometimes it's security, sometimes it's the black market, sometimes it's aesthetics. The Jewish presence in town is ugly, so we must move them out of sight, behind walls. So that I would say it is an improvised local set of decisions that proceeds over time. But behind that, there is a basic consensus that these ghettos are temporary, that sometime in the future, they will serve as a staging ground for Jewish expulsion. They are kind of warehouses. I mean, they are urban concentration camps, serving as warehouses for the Jewish population until the Jews can be expelled out of Poland to some reservation. Now, we know in hindsight that instead of serving as a staging ground for expulsion abroad, they become the staging ground for expulsion to the death camps. But that was not what was in mind when they were founded. There were no death camps. There were no notion of death camps. The vision was still sending Jews out of the German sphere, expulsion and decimation, not yet systematic and total extermination. So the Germans, like they did so often, they improvise and then they adapt. having the ghettos, they used the ghettos as very efficient and useful instruments to stage the deportations to the death camps, but that is a later adaptation. That is not an original intention.
How would you define
Alemán, primero en Polonia y después en la Unión Soviética, frente a las decisiones tomadas en Berlín, frente a las decisiones tomadas por las SS y frente a las acciones llevadas a cabo por los Einsatzgruppen, primero en Polonia, con respecto a la inteligencia polaca, y después en la Unión Soviética con el holocausto por las balas? ¿Cuál fue el rol del ejército alemán?
I think the trajectory of the German army between the outbreak of war through Poland to the invasion of the Soviet Union is certainly one of moral degeneration. That in Poland, some of the army officers were still capable of moral indignation. They could still witness atrocities and be upset by them. We had in September of '39 a number of complaints by army officers about atrocities committed by the police, the SS, and others, and even by some of their own troops. The German army court-martials a number of soldiers in September of '39 for committing war crimes, for abuse of the civilian population, for breaking, in a sense, the laws of war. When Hitler makes very clear that there is devil's work to be done in Poland, as he says, the army, in a sense, is relieved to turn things over in October of '39 to a civilian administration, to wash their hands. They had come into Poland saying that this was a war against the Polish army, not the Polish civilian population, but they take no responsibility for protecting the people they have conquered. They very quickly wash their hands of any responsibility for what takes place in Poland, are glad to turn it over to others, and turn a blind eye thereafter to what is happening in Poland. Now, when Hitler wins so unexpectedly in the West in May and June of 1940, and is now heralded as the unparalleled military genius who has done what the Army Officer Corps couldn't do itself in World War I, another key step has been taken. The Army Officer Corps basically loses confidence in its own traditions and its own sort of expertise, and is swept away in the euphoria of victory, swept away in what seems to be the genius of the Fuhrer, and willing now to concede to him and to essentially fatalistically resign loyalty to him that they may have had some hesitations about earlier. And with the invasion of the Soviet Union, of course, now we have yet another aspect to be added, and that this is going to be not just a military conflict, but an ideological conflict against Bolshevism. And one thing that is a absolutely overlapping goal between the German army and the Nazi regime is both desire for territorial conflict and a destruction of communism. And that the army therefore sees this as a kind of crusade. This is not just a military battle between armies, as they had seen the conflict between Germany and France. This is going to be also an ideological crusade, and that they are willing then to invest into it and be willing to carry out in this actions that they earlier might not have wanted or been hesitant about, but now that they've in a sense given themselves heart, body, and soul to Hitler and have committed and truly believe in an anti-communist crusade, any last kind of inhibitions, any last restraints, I think, are gone, and the military takes part in the planning for a war of destruction. No preparations to take care of Russian prisoners of war who will die like flies, buying into preparations to live off the countryside and to starve Soviet citizens by the millions, the so-called hunger plan. They buy into plans to basically shoot communist commissars, not extend POW protections to political enemies, and buy into and mandate issues of collective reprisal that whole villages and regions where there was opposition around the lines, they will punish the civilian population. They will not respect any distinction between combatant and non-combatant. And so the army is primed to carry out war atrocities, to carry out basically genocidal policies when they invade the Soviet Union, that this has been a process of degeneration between September 1939 and June of 1941.
You just mentioned
de genocidio, y también habló la acción, ¿no?, de los Einsatzgruppen en Polonia antes de la invasión a la Unión Soviética, con la aniquilación de la inteligencia polaca a través de fusilamientos, que fueron enviados a Alemania, que fueron encarcelados. ¿Cómo calificaría usted la política de los nazis hacia los polacos no judíos? ¿Las calificaría como políticas genocidas?
A lot of this depends upon what definition one uses of genocide, and that's a hotly contested issue. Raphael Lemkin, who invented the term, in fact speaks both of genocide as total physical extermination, which is modeled on the Holocaust paradigm, but he also speaks of the destruction of the underlying foundations of national life, of the erasure of national identity, which he used the term cultural genocide. And I would make the distinction, I would accept that distinction. And then what Hitler aimed at, what the Nazis aimed at in Poland, is to erase the notion of Polish nationality, the consciousness of Polish nationality, but not to kill every last Pole. They want Polish slave labor. On the other hand, what they arrive at in terms of European Jews by 1941, as Peter Hayes will, I think, argue next week, is a concept of genocide, meaning total physical annihilation, the killing of every last Jew, man, woman, and child the Nazis can lay their hands on. My own view is those decisions are reached in the summer and fall of 1941. But even in the spring of 1941, there's what I call an implied genocide. That is, in preparing for the war of destruction in the Soviet Union, there are already plans to starve millions of Soviet citizens. There are already plans to kill and shoot hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens by reprisal measures and repression of opposition. There are already plans to have millions of Soviet prisoners perish of starvation and epidemic because they're simply not going to take care of them, not going to feed them and provide them with medical care. And there are also plans to expel large, ultimately Himmler said, we have 30 to 40 million too many Slavs in these areas, to expel them into Siberia. Now, wherever people went hungry and starved in the Nazi Empire, Jews starved first. They're at the bottom of the food chain. Wherever people were shot in mass numbers, Jews are shot in higher percentages than anyone else. And wherever people are expelled in large numbers, no Jews are going to be left behind. That is, they, in a sense, are, wherever policies of destruction and persecution are in place, Jews are always going to take it the worst first. So that even though there wasn't an explicit plan for killing all Jews in the Soviet Union in the spring of 41, the implication of the other policies they did have in place, if they were applied to Jews first and most, it was going to be a genocide of the Jews at some time by some methods not yet specified. The methods and timetable were not yet there. But the notion that in the end, there would be no Jews in the German sphere of the Soviet Union by some combination of shooting, expulsion, and starvation was basically there for anybody who wanted to think about it. Now they go beyond sometime, somewhere, somehow to now here by mass execution as in the summer of 41. So it goes from implied genocide to actual practiced genocide.
Bien, vamos ya cerrando, ¿sí? con la última pregunta, que es la siguiente. Si los nazis hubieran vencido a la Unión Soviética y a Inglaterra, entonces, ¿no habría sido necesaria la solución final porque la expulsión y la muerte en el camino lo habría hecho por sí misma?
You know, speculative history is basically just that. I mean, to say what would have happened if is always not a game based on evidence, but based upon extrapolation. And that basically is not an historian's method. So I would say, first of all, I can't answer that question because historians work at explaining what happened, not at predicting the future, even if it's the future in the past tense. But if you want me to speculate, I would say certainly if they had quickly conquered the Soviet Union, they would have still, I think, by the summer already in the process of killing Soviet Jews locally, that probably they would have ended up building death camps, but they would have been much further east. That is, they would have ended up shipping the Jews of Europe not to Polish death camps in Poland, but to death camps in the Ural Mountains or someplace like that. That in the end, once they had crossed the line of genocide against Soviet Jews, I think the temptation to extend that to the rest of Jews under their control would have been overwhelming. That would have, in a sense, having begun genocide, they would not have withdrawn or stopped with Soviet Jewry, but would have proceeded with the rest of European Jewry too. But that is, that's speculation. I can't give you an answer based on evidence because we have no evidence for what didn't happen.
Thank you very much. And with this, we will.
No tenemos palabras para agradecerles lo que ha sido para nosotros tenerlo aquí, lo esclarecedora que ha sido toda su disertación. Así que le agradecemos.